I think the data lock-in of the semantic ontology layer is going to be
Oh.
unlike anything we've ever seen, which is, okay, there is some lock-in on databases, right? Like if you're on Oracle, it's really, really hard to get out of it. Imagine if you're a company that is like the semantic ontology company, and literally like not only is your structured data, you know, mapped there and all the relationships there, but if there's like a decade of reinforcement learning done to like map out all of the idiosyncrasies of your company, would you dare rip it out and have that collapse and then like literally all of your agentic workflows depend on that to survive? Welcome to Agentic Data episode 7. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Joseph. Welcome back.
Yes, we've been gone again for a bit, but hopefully we're more consistent going forward. A lot has happened since we've been gone, and a lot has happened in the past few weeks, I think. More consolidation has happened.
Yep.
And I think the most exciting thing that has happened, and I think we've seen this coming to some degree, and I think you've seen this coming as well. Fivetran and DBT merged to become the Informatica of our generation. That was interesting. What do you think about this, Robert?
It's a thing that
As somebody who cried wolf once and caused chaos in the community, what do you think about this time around? When the rumors were actually true.
The rumors are actually true
of the pending acquisition.
Yeah, something about this whole thing feels really weird to me, Joseph. I don't exactly know how to articulate it yet, but like I think historically, for those who haven't been around since the conception of DBT and Fivetran, DBT and Fivetran both anchored their like the modern data stack movement, and they did so by pushing for this process of ELT over ETL, right? It's like dump all the data in the warehouse and then use warehouse as the central processor to be able to do transformations. DBT handles all those transformations, and then Fivetran becomes like the ELT vendor in a sense. Like it dumps all the data in raw format. And I feel like the promise was like, obviously, like ELT and over ETL, like this paradigm still remains, and the modern data stack still like is alive in Fivetran now. But at the same time, doesn't it feel like there was some sort of promise that was broken here? And I think the community feels it too. Like it's not clear exactly why, but like I feel like all the principles that were not explicitly said but like pointed to by the modern data stack are being violated.
Like composability and the independence of the vendors and
like exactly. It's like an open source. DBT is an open source framework, and like I feel like the promise was like, hey, look, it wasn't explicit, but like we're creating we have this like horizontal layer for you to independently own one of the more important pieces. Like analysts were empowered to be able to now do all this stuff that they couldn't do before. Like I don't know. I mean, this is like outside of the fact that like the having the single surface area for monetization and pricing against like dumping data in and transforming it feels a little bit weird anyway. But that always felt weird, right? I don't know. It just feels odd. What do you think, Joseph?
I guess it makes perfect sense in terms of the business, business dynamics and the power structure and so forth. I mean, to some degree, I have a slightly cynical view on these things, and I think part of the reason why companies started to take slices of the modern data stack and just claim it as their own is because it's easier to fund companies that way, especially in a dynamic where you have maybe 10 VC firms that are really investing in data companies, and it's in their best interest to not really conflict with each other and not to conflict within their own firm. So it's, in some sense, there is some incentive for companies to not overlap with each other or intersect with each other. And so from that perspective, I think that modern data stack was a movement that was catalyzed by investors, namely like Andreessen Horowitz was a main propagator of this. So it kind of makes sense that the companies formed that way. But then eventually things had to consolidate, just due to business and power dynamics reasons and pricing reasons and so forth. And I think the first eigenvector there is the fact that probably the market was just not large enough for many players. And we've seen this. We've done this. We've did our tour of duty, the data notebook space, realized that actually data notebooks, the notebook is a good wedge, but it's not the company. The company is, I mean, there are a few ways to build that notebook company. I mean, one way is to actually just become a BI company. And that's what the number one player in the space right now, Hex, is doing. Hex is becoming a BI company, right? So I think generally speaking, businesses have to expand their pie. There's this slightly unnatural thing that has happened, or maybe it is natural in the sense of if you believe in this Y Combinator esque strategy of like take a small slice of the pie and then expand, then
Yeah.
then what has happened is pretty logical, which is the companies got formed by taking small slices of the stack, but then to stay relevant and stay afloat, people had to merge, and you know, and there's also this counterfactual strategy, which is Databricks, which is this is not the modern data stack movement. We are just going to do the entire thing, starting with the query engine, starting with Spark, and then go upwards and just basically do everything, try to do everything in the stack. So that there's that strategy. And there's a strategy that is even more extreme, which is a Palantir strategy, which is we're literally just going to do everything ourselves, but we're going to basically partner with no one. And we're going to have our distribution channel. We're going to have this forward deployed engineering type of distribution channel, which will give us a pricing advantage, which will propagate down to a product advantage, and then go from that perspective. And Palantir was traditionally not fundable in the traditional sense by traditional blue chip VCs, so that kind of makes sense. But if you're playing the traditional VC game, then what has happened in this world makes a lot of sense. And if you're to be a little bit cynical, then like, the open source movement was really sort of this facade type of situation. I don't
Yeah.
think it was a facade in DBT's case, but one could say that partially it's sort of a facade.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, obviously, like, this was never. It's not like DBT promised any of these things, but like I feel like the one of the biggest draws to DBT in the beginning was that you now had ownership of the logic layer, like the orchestrate, like not the orchestrate, like the logic of transformations, right? And that that kind of points to like, hey, look, we're kind of like we're like Switzerland in this entire like data stack world, right? We're like a neutral party, a neutral piece of middleware where you can define your most important stuff and you can kind of like anchor your career on this part, which a lot of people did, right? There's all these analytics engineers out there. And like there's something that feels already violated about, going to Fivetran, like Fivetran is like very much not that, right? And it's obviously like, again, like I'm not trying to be too judgmental here. Like this is, as like you're stating, it's kind of the natural course that a company has to take, especially when you discover like, maybe the market isn't big enough or whatever. But it's just like, I mean, this to me is like even one of the things. Like I feel like there's more. Like it's almost like a I don't want to get too like, I don't know, word sally about this, but like it feels kind of like separation of church and state is being violated. You know what I mean, Joseph? Like it's like in some sense, like DBT set themselves up in a way where they didn't own anything. Like they just you own the logic and we just have like some minimal orchestration layer that kind of can be hosted. And that was like an exceptionally appealing vision to many people. But now it's kind of like, all right, we're gonna slowly eat more of that pie. And again, like I'm being really naive here. Like this is the naive perspective, but it's just this is the voice of like, me as a individual contributor, right? I do viscerally feel like this is at odds with the way that the thing that got me so excited about DBT in the beginning. I think a lot of people are kind of up in arms about it too. But just to put this aside for a second, there's also all the kind of weird stuff that has happened ahead of this acquisition, right? Which it's not really directly pointing to any of this like contract violation around open source promises or anything. But like a couple episodes ago, we talked about how STF was acquired by DBT. And we also talked about how SQL Mesh was acquired by Fivetran, or maybe we didn't, but that happened in the interim. What looks super funny to me is that like STF and SQL Mesh are DBT's primary competitors, right? One of them obviously got bought up by DBT, and that made a lot of sense, right? And then DBT Fusion or whatever it's called, like it made a lot of sense. But it looks so suspicious that Fivetran went and got SQL Mesh, their other competitor, and now the two of them are merging together, thereby removing all like it's not just like the transformation tooling. It's more that like they like they like obliterated any potential like community based opposition, which is very interesting to me.
Because there's an alternate universe in which, let's say, Airbyte and DBT join forces because they're both
Right.
open source and they could actually propagate a more community driven movement for much longer.
Yeah,
But I think
absolutely.
there is some factors at play. I mean, I think perhaps Martin Casado and Andreessen Horowitz, I think he might be sitting on both a DBT and a
Mm.
trans boards. And I think we talked to Martin like a long time ago, like 2020, and then DBT just raised a Series A, and then we talked to him about that, and he said that they're not really that competitive. Fivetran is using DBTs, something like that. Which
Yeah.
by the fact that he brought it up first, we didn't even ask him about if it's competitive or not. It clearly shows you that there was always room for competition here,
Yeah.
and it was a very sensitive topic in terms of Andreessen trying to claim independence from both like the competition between the two companies, right? So it does seem like to me, reading between the lines, it was pretty clear to like a very smart investor that invested in both companies that this was going to be an issue down the
Yeah.
line, and it just happened, and it was facilitated by the fact that the two companies were pretty close to begin with.
Yeah.
But spiritually, it does seem like a violation because I think there is some amount of goodwill, some amount of non
Mhm.
trivial goodwill that is actually brought to you if you are open source because you have this sort of obligation to the community that you're going to do right by them in some sense. Maybe the one thing that you're supposed to do is to prevent vendor lock-in and make sure that and
Yeah.
then why do you care about vendor lock-in? I think it's because you don't want to feel like you're being taken hostage by the
Yeah.
vendor and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
price gouged. So I think that's probably what's happening because it's like, oh, this it's the platform that I'm not going to get price gouged in, and then there were some complaints that Fivetran is a platform that it is price gouging folks. Some other people's words, not mine. And from that perspective, if you're a platform like DBT that is supposed to
Yeah.
be non-vendor locked in,
Yep.
non-price gouging, that joins forces with a price gouging company, then all of a sudden you feel like, oh, it's the end of this era of non-vendor locked in, and then
Yeah.
it's the beginning of an era of price gouging. That's probably the
Yeah.
emotional undercurrent here.
Yeah, that's right. And like as you're saying that, it occurs to me like this gives Fivetran exceptional leverage because okay, look, they can now like squeeze the warehouse companies if they wanted to, right? Like Fivetran controls the ingest, DBT controls the transformation. They don't have to do it like so blatantly, but they could just be like, yeah, here, like ClickHouse is better, or like Snowflake is just a little bit better. Like we support it a little bit better. Transformations are supported a little bit better, and then suddenly like the cabal like accretes, and it's like I mean, it's like if you, I don't know, I'm trying to draw an analogy, and I'm so bad at these on the fly, but just imagine like you own both like the grocery store as well as like the kitchen construction company or something, and like by dictating what is being sold in the grocery store, you also affect what the kitchen is able to cook. And then maybe there's something upstream. I guess that would be DBT. Like there's like I don't know, whatever. But you get the idea. Like there's some level of market control that they now have, which is just to be like to put my like entrepreneur hat on for a second. Like it's an exceptional move, right? Like when you control the pipes, you can direct where the water flows. And now Fivetran owns basically all the pipes.
Right. And it's not surprising because literally their category was called ETL, and then they transformed that into ELT, and then they were only doing EL, and then now they have EL anti. So it's not a big surprise. It's just they're going into the old world. I mean, vendors used to control ET and L, and
Yeah.
in this brave new world, you had E and L and T separately, and then surprise, surprise, you combine EL and T. And if history serves as any guide, I think the reason why a company like Informatica was able to get pretty large in its space is because I think it professed neutrality on the compute domain. So it purported that it's Switzerland for the database that you choose as the analytical database, right? So you could choose any analytical database, and then we'll just support whatever thing that you want to do. And I think we're a little bit too young to understand that that's a really good business proposition. Where I
Yeah.
think we now assume that you can mix and match different data warehouses with different parts of the data stack, and that's really good for the end customer. But I think in the beginning, everything was bundled. Like you had
Yeah.
to use some of the BI capabilities that was built on top of a data warehouse, and a lot of BI companies had like its own data warehouse that you had to connect to. I think like doesn't Domo do this still? So it makes sense that that strategy of like we are independent from the data compute plane,
Yeah.
Snowflake and Databricks, and we're the largest company that could play that strategy. That makes
Yep.
perfect sense
Yep.
to me from
Yep.
a strategic point of view. And then from
Yeah.
Snowflake and Databricks' point of view, they are going into more of the ETL and streaming layer. I
Yeah.
think Snowflake acquired a company to build Snowflake OpenFlow, which is their own version of trying to control the inflow into the data warehouse, so it could remain autonomous and more independent from vendors like Fivetran. So there is this cat and mouse game that's going on. Like friends become enemies, enemies become friends, and partners become enemies. And classic, this is classical Microsoft type of situation.
Yeah.
Microsoft partner up with Databricks, and it made Databricks on top of Azure Databricks, and now they have Fabric, and Fabric runs on Spark. And so what the hell happened? I thought you were partners, but you copied everything, and then you have your own thing now. But if you have a sufficiently broad ecosystem, I think this happens where it is in your best interest to work together, and then at some point, it is not in your best interest to work together, and you must fight for survival on its own.
Yeah.
And I think if history rhymes with the present, then I think what's going to happen is probably the Fivetran DBT combination is going to be the Informatica of our era. And, no matter what Databricks and Snowflake tries to do, that company, that Fivetran, the combined Fivetran entity will probably be quite strong against the database vendors, and it'll be resilient against some shocks that may happen, which is people might be ripping out Fivetran, for example. I don't know what that's
Yeah.
happening, but a lot of people complain about Fivetran bills, and people might be porting over to things, say Airbyte or something like that, or OpenFlow. As a merged entity, you have more time to actually try to figure things out. And then,
Oh
as
yeah.
we
Yeah.
know, from a pricing and business model standpoint, if you have a combined entity, then you could offer much more attractive terms to your customers, because you have so many different ways to monetize than just monetize in a very sort of unnatural manner. So that unnatural business model can go away if you're able to just connect EL and T together. The best is actually if you have ELT and P, like the productionization part, which is
Yeah.
the application building part, and if you have the AI part, you have ELTPA. If you have all of it, and if you're composable, then you have like the best business model ever, because you
Yeah.
could really try to extract value somewhere in the most optimal way, so that it's a win-win for the customer and the company. Like the customer gets to pay a lower price that they would have otherwise paid if they got everything separately. The vendor could always come up with a pricing strategy, pricing model
Yep.
for that
Yep. Yep.
customer that is maximally beneficial for both parties at the same time. So there are some benefits there.
Yeah. And it's like it's interesting because if you were to go back in time and tell me like the entity that is now Fivetran and DBT was say like a startup, and they just started in that exact same shape, and their entire value prop was just like, hey, what we're gonna do is we're gonna move transformations after the loading, and like that's it, that's their whole life, and we're gonna just manage that orchestration process. I'd be
Probably
like,
not.
why the would I invest in that company?
Yeah, would not have happened. Probably would not have happened. So there's
Uh,
some interestingness of maybe it is a path dependent situation, right?
yeah,
In
yeah,
physics, like
absolutely.
where like you have to go in this path, and sort of this integral. If you think about the integral as like the value created by this company, it's like a
Yeah,
path dependent integral, and so you can't see the end outcome and then try to start the company in that way. Maybe what DBT and Fivetran did was actually quite optimal for them to get to this stage.
yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a brilliant from that perspective. It's really like a brilliant series of like the path is really brilliant, right? It's like leverage the illusion of permanence that you give from being open source that like follows the desires of the general community. Use that to build independent businesses and then merge them back together.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's so strange.
Yeah, and the details really matter here. I think that, but if I were to have a guess, I think it was actually quite earnest. Like the DBT
Oh,
situation
yeah.
was
Yeah,
quite
yeah. I agree.
earnest.
I'm not yeah.
Yeah, in from that genesis and everything. I think that's why it really resonated with folks. I think we're also realizing that. I mean, we are an open source company too, and I think
Absolutely.
what we're realizing that is, I think it's really hard to fake that like open source earnestness.
Yeah.
If you are just doing the open source thing just because you want to, and then you have this plan, this evil plan of screwing your customers over later or something like
True,
that.
true,
I
true.
generally think it doesn't really work. But
Yeah,
if you're under pressure to grow your revenues in a scalable way and durable way, then I think you just make a business decision that is perhaps a little bit deviant from how you started. A business's objective is to survive. One of the
that's right.
objectives, right? And it's much better for the community for DBT to survive and to support DBT rather than it to die. Like Docker, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
went through some really terrible times. And so it's I guess it's a compromise between the community and the company. So
Yeah, that's
it's not super cynical.
That's right, and I'm getting off my high horse. My high horse, I've like kicked it off into the distance. It's fleeing over there. I totally agree with you, Joseph. There's no real vitriol here. Clearly, Joseph is the CEO and I'm the CTO of our company. For anyone listening, if you didn't know that, but yeah, I can recognize like yeah. I'm trying to analyze the feeling, the initial reaction that I have, but of course, like once you recognize it, just can let it go and understand that in the grand scheme of things, there's other constraints that just have to be met.
It's interesting. Interesting lesson in business history. Okay, moving on to the next topic. So I think in the past few weeks, we've seen that context engineering as this
Um,
natural successor to prompt engineering has been popping up all over my feed, at least in terms of some investors and also practitioners actually openly talking about this on LinkedIn and X and so forth. Once things hit LinkedIn, you know that this is kind of going
yep,
more
it's bang.
mainstream, and this has hit LinkedIn status. And I have a quote for you. Let me read
Sure.
this. One thing that is becoming abundantly clear is that the AI application companies that recognize the importance of the shift from good prompt engineering to great context engineering, i.e.,
Yeah,
how to best model, enrich, and retrieve domain specific context early, will be the ones with the best shot at winning their categories.
yeah,
The strongest apps will understand the underlying data most precisely and build rich affordances and pipelines to feedback user
yep,
generated metadata into their living, breathing data model. The data model, or ontology, as Palantir would call it, can become a compounding asset. There has to be a semantic foundation underpinning it, a model of entities, relationships between them, and rich metadata that shapes how information should be prioritized and interpreted. This is a profound moment for, I think, our industry and just the general enterprise software category at large, because I think this is a situation in which something that has existed in the data domain, which is the concept of
mhm,
a semantic layer or semantic ontology or whatever you want to call it, is propagating into all of enterprise software at large. So
yeah,
you have this
mhm,
thing that was necessitated by the fact that you needed a layer between how the data was physically stored in a database or data warehouse and sort of the business computation that had to be done. And now this concept is becoming ubiquitous because of this explosion of AI applications. And
yeah, yeah,
so this is telling me that, like we thought before, an LLM in an enterprise software context could be thought of as some sort of English-based query engine. So instead of querying in SQL, your data warehouse, you could think of, okay, you're interacting with this agent, and in some sense, you are querying the LLM in natural language, and you're supposed to get some results back. And of course, there has to be a way for that English to retrieve objects in the correct way. And so there has to be in the structured data world, of course, you need a way for the English to be translated into SQL so that you could get the data back. And for that purpose, usually a semantic layer is used. And if you're thinking about let's just think about like a unstructured context, like I'm pulling data from like Notion and Slack and Salesforce or whatever it is, more unstructured stuff, like just text. It makes sense that you have this layer that transforms the based English into the API calls that gets the data. And those API calls are kind of like the SQL being generated and executed against. But
yeah,
it's much easier to conceptualize and also to build in a robust way if there was actually a middle layer that governed how that English got translated into API. So, okay. So, in conclusion, I think for structured data, generally the pattern is English to a middle layer that transforms that English into SQL queries. Here in this other world where you're pulling data from, say, applications, then you have English to this middle layer that is translating that English into precise API calls to retrieve that data, and then you can synthesize it and give it all back. And now,
Yeah.
if you're thinking that you have the LLM, if you have an LLM that takes care of both things, then you could very naturally join the two middle layers together. The
Yeah.
semantic layer for the data warehouse, the semantic layer for application data pulling. You can merge it into a single entity and just call that just a semantic ontology. And this is our own view. This is how it should be. And I think this independent discovery of this concept from a different angle, from different enterprise applications that is not structured data, is, I
Mhm.
think, a very, very good sign for the industry at large that you have to govern the context. And we are calling that semantic retrieval engine. That's what we're calling it. Perhaps the lingo from AI, like the AI purist, is going from prompt engineering to just context engineering. And
Mm,
that's like similar to what we say in the sense of, hey, you shouldn't do text to SQL. Text to SQL is sort of like the prompt engineering esque
yeah.
feeling thing. What you should be doing is actually you should be creating deterministic scaffolds that allow you to retrieve and synthesize the data better. And that's actually adding more structured. Like prompt feels non-structured, kind of loose. Context feels structured. I think that is happening. And I think that's also very similar to, I think, vibe coding going from just pure prompt engineering based vibe coding to build pretty naive applications to, if you want to build like enterprise grade applications, you're probably going to have a lot of guardrails around how things are built, and perhaps things like PRDs and to-do lists and checkpoints and
Yep. Yep. Yep.
orchestration has to happen in between. So I think a few things here. One is, like, I think this is a great moment for our industry and the industry at large in terms of this context engineering thing and the semantic ontology becoming a first class citizen. And also, I think this pattern actually persists in everything, every layer of the stack. This
Yeah.
pattern of you have to add more structure around the instructions to get to better outcomes. And of course, if you say it like that, it sounds extremely trivial, but um, that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is a really interesting topic. And it also makes my brain explode a little bit, Joseph, because I feel like even the way that we're talking about it, it's still like mired in the way that it's set by our initial condition, which is starting with our understanding of how data handles this problem with the semantic layer. But like one way that we've talked about extending. So essentially, just to take a step back, essentially what this guy is saying, and what you're saying, Joseph, is like there has to be some sort of like context architecture, context parsing architecture, context retrieval architecture that kind of defines how reasoning happens, such that like levels of guardrails, determinism, or flexibility, on the other hand, are played with and injected at exactly the right moments, such that like, yeah, you have an LLM that can pull back semantic entities, right? Like things that are defined business quantities that shouldn't change, but then it can play with them and build them into like random ass analyses that can tell you, here's how I predict what our revenue is going to look like next year, right? You want this like this control over every step of the reasoning process. And what's confusing to me, and I think I don't know exactly where the future will go, is like some parts of this, like some parts of how you would define context within a corporate environment are like very clear, right? Like there are metrics, there are dimensions. These are bona fide entities that we're very used to reasoning around. But then like if you just take a step back and go a little bit more abstract, there's like multi-step analyses, which we obviously build workflows for that become like things that you might want to do repeatedly, right? Like there's reports that you generate, like weekly business reports, whatever, that follow a very specific format. But then like even more abstractly, there are ways that you access APIs, but also ways that like you reason around interacting with the APIs
Yeah.
and with the semantic. Like there are pathways, like not everything should be hardened just in like our traditional understanding of semantics. You know what I mean? Like there's other things that should be always deterministic, like it's like, okay, imagine, I'm going to try to come up with another analogy, but like imagine like your computer broke, right? And you work at a big tech company, there's an IT department. Maybe the first thing that you do is like a suite of like random rote tasks that you have like internalized or are useful for debugging whether your computer can be fixed. It's like you turn it off, you turn it back on, you Google the problem, You check on your knowledge base, and then like finally you go to your like IT help desk and you
Sure.
ask for help, right? And there's like a sequencing to this that is like optimal for like some objective function.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like you probably have hardened that workflow in your brain such that you
Yeah.
know, like, I'm going to turn my computer on, off and on. I'm going to go like test out these things. I'm going to Google it and then I'm going to go to the IT department. And like that's just a formula you have in your brain. But like imagine if you operated like an LLM as it does now, and what you do is like you just have a bunch of those tools and you just decide at the moment what feels best. And like you're just like, okay, it's almost like a random selection because LLMs hallucinate, right? They don't have all the context all the time. So like your computer breaks and then one day you're just like, I'm just gonna go to the IT department. But it turns out all that happened was like your browser froze and the
Yeah.
guy's just like, are you an idiot? You should just close your browser. So this is a very like contrived example. What I'm trying to point to is like, I think there's a way that all of this, like the sequencing, the reasoning, the context, it's not just about like supplying the context and then hoping that the LLM can parse it, but I think constructing systems such that the right things can be hardened and reused. Obviously, like I'm
That's
just
correct.
really in our own
Yeah.
home.
I mean, I think that's correct. And I think, but you have to start with getting the right context to begin with, because that is not being done today, right? So
That's right.
if you thought about, I mean, this is very akin to, say you started okay, say you started a new company or like a new country, like a new organization that needs to scale. In the beginning, you're going to make all kinds of mistakes and you're just going to wing it. And eventually over time, you actually equilibrate into some optimal pattern, right? And that pattern we all learned, and like all the brains in an organization all learned and equilibrate to the same pattern, right? But like, what is the first thing that you have to do when you start a new organization? You just need to retrieve that object. Like you need to just get
Yeah.
that information and then figure out what to do with it. Like
Yeah.
if you need like access to the HR software, you just need to get access, get permissions. That's like the first order of business, like the zeroth order of
Yeah.
business. And then you figure out, okay, I shouldn't be pinging the fucking CEO for this all the time. And then you kind of gate it. The objective function now has like cost, like social cost baked into it, which will naturally develop over time. So I think we are propagating it the right way, which is like we're not even able to get the right data from the data warehouse to begin with. Like, okay, let's just start with
Yeah.
that. Once we start with that, and once we get the right information from Notion and Slack or other business systems and CRMs and whatnot, okay, then I think I agree. Then you
Yeah.
construct
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
actually the optimal reasoning path around how to even think about the retrieval as its own thing, as its own first class citizen. What does a reasoning path look like? And in a lot of the cases, you could probably hard code the determinism around what that enterprise expects in many many different scenarios. And if we believe that if almost everything is power law distributed, meaning that in every sort of functional domain, there's only like a few paths that really matter, workflows that really matter, then you could
Yeah.
actually go ahead and program that in, of course, with sufficient variables so that they kind of become your basis vectors that kind of span
Yeah.
the whole space with a few, like very finite amount of basis vectors. And that needs to be totally part of that context engineering thing. I don't even know, it might be a different term to describe
Yeah.
the reasoning path. And there's probably many, many layers to this cake. And this entire cake, I think, this entire cake is like one of the most important objects in a
Yeah.
company. And that's part of what we're building, is we call that the semantic ontology and the semantic retrieval engine, but that object is very, very important. And
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course, that
Yeah.
object needs to not be solely reliant on humans manually labeling things and manually inputting data. It's a
Yeah.
living system that gets the inputs and outputs of all the interactions and tries to put it back into the system and tries to learn from it, right? Maybe
Yep. Yep.
it's
Yep.
not reinforcement learning, but it needs
Wow.
to, okay, there's some amount of reinforcement learning, there's some amount of stupid deterministic learning, there's some amount of configurations, but that entire system has to work so that it keeps on compounding itself. And I think that's what the author of this post is alluding to, and certainly
Yeah.
this is how we're thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like your analogy of like, I mean, starting a company, or it is really like, I'm imagining like, obviously, Joseph, you and I have established a lot of patterns of behavior and kind of like rules of like principles of how we do things from just working together. And of course, like I'm imagining like a person coming into a company, like if a person joined us today, there's some level of context that he could get by just like getting knowledge, but like tribal knowledge isn't just like the context. It is also like the patterns of behavior. Like, okay, you have to always make decision docs or whatever when you're making important decisions. You have to label them type 1, type 2. If it's type 1, we got to elevate to the founder, how we forego traditional hiring criteria and like come up with our own, right? Like all this stuff is, yeah, it's like, it's so, the analogy is really apt because it really points to yeah, context is clearly the first eigenvector. You can get a lot just by like reading, say, our Notion and our Slack history and stuff. But the key is really like ultimately traversing the pathways of like finding the eigenvectors of behavior that govern a particular process. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think this is probably you could abstract it out even further, which is
Oh,
imagine if you're starting a country, and I think, one of the
I
foundations
get
of a
that.
country is the law, and you gotta define some rights that people have. And like if you're
Yeah.
founding the United States of America, you start with the Constitution, or
Yep. Yep.
and
Yep.
then
Yep.
you have the Bill of Rights, and et cetera. And so you construct that scaffold, and then you have basic rights that are not to be violated. And from
Yep.
those rights, you propagate forward all sorts of other laws and other legislation and so forth. And so I think there's something more abstract here where if you are propagating a, say, like a word based system, which actually it is, okay, so if we think that this middle layer is going to be like some sort of YAML based system or something like that, it's kind of a configuration system, it's a YAML based system. Kind of, it is like writing a corpus of law. It's
Yeah.
all in
Yeah. Yeah.
text. Okay. And so there's something to the effect of if you're trying to propagate this like law based system, you have some core primitives like rights, and then you
Yeah.
propagate that all the way down, and then things become very complex and things equilibrialize, right? Like as in,
Yeah.
slavery was once allowed and now it's outlawed, and like the system itself could learn how to self-regulate and self-modify, and I
Yes.
think there's something abstract here where it could be generalized to all sorts of domains. And from that perspective, this makes perfect sense that you start with just retrieving the right information for you to
Fine.
for the
Fine. Yeah.
LLM to observe, and then you come up with all sorts of other more sophisticated techniques to use that in a certain way, and then also take action in a certain way, permissioning. Like it's just going to become this very big corpus, and just like how each country has a corpus of laws,
Mm.
probably each big enough company, enterprise, is going to have its own corpus, the semantic ontology corpus. And
Yeah.
that's going to be a very, very important thing. And I feel like, okay, now I'm getting somewhere. I think the data lock in of the semantic ontology layer is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen, which is, okay, there is some lock in on databases, right? Like if you're on Oracle, it's really, really hard to, get out of it, and that's why Oracle is like, such a gigantic company, and database companies do so well. Imagine if you're a company that is like the semantic ontology company, and literally like not only is your structured data, you know, mapped there and all the relationships there, but there's like if there's like a decade of reinforcement learning done to like map out all the idiosyncrasies of your company, would you dare rip it out and have that collapse, and then like literally all of your agentic workflows depend on that to survive? And so this is a massive business opportunity, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I this is a tangent, but I want to point out that you kind of sound like a physicist.
Yeah.
And reasoning being like, it reminds me of complex systems, right? You're basically saying like define the initial rules of a system, and then like all the emergent properties are kind of predicated based on like everything will just fall out, right?
Yeah.
And like once you have the content, but like, I don't know, like there's something. Yeah, sorry, I'm anchoring on this a little bit too much, but like that may be true, but I feel like nonetheless, like there's like an emergence of like from a okay. Let me go with your analogy. Like you start a country, right? All the laws will beget more laws, and then the system will grow organically, and then you'll have a certain like system of government that really like adheres to whatever
Yeah.
initial conditions you had. But like there's also like there's kind of intangible like culture comes out, right? And probably in large part from the way that those laws were first passed. I guess what I'm trying to get to is like culture might be an even more defining characteristic of a country than the laws themselves. And while it might be derivable, like the culture might be derivable from the laws, it's much more practical to determine some mechanism by which to take the object that is culture and map that and simulate that in some way such that it can be leveraged by the LLM. And now I'm going back to the analogy, but like you kind of see the I'm going doing away with the analogy, but do you see where I'm kind of getting to? I don't know why I'm fighting this battle. I actually totally agree with you. I think context is more important, is like the most important thing. I'm just kind of getting to like there's something hazy off in this corner of like emergent property world where like things need to in order for you really to have a system that can behave correctly with respect to a culture, and perhaps that's like an organization's culture, that culture needs to be hardened in a way that probably can't be done with like simple context, but instead like perhaps behavioral patterns.
Yeah, but the behavioral patterns get learned by that semantic ontology, right, over time, and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Theoretically.
And
But yeah.
but how else would you? But
No, no, no,
also,
yeah.
okay. Also, I mean, that's a limitation of just software in general, right? Like,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
like in a company, only like a partial amount of things could be done through software and agents, right? And you still have
Yeah.
people. Like, why would you have? You still need people, and the collection of people defines sort of that culture. And of course, like the whole system is useless if people all revolt in using that system, right? So, like, so that's a
Um,
pathological corner case of the mathematician. And then, of course, like so from that perspective, of course, the culture matters more than the usage of the platform because the culture could actually completely negate the system. So, but this is the limitations of software and agents in general, not anything else. It's just a fundamental limitation of we're tool builders and we build tools, and the humans refuse to use the tools in a certain way, then our fundamental assumptions get destroyed, and there is some sort of semantic separation between the people who are the organization, the culture, and the people using it, and the tools themselves. And the tools have to assume a certain level of constraints to begin with. So I'm just conditional on that, and I'm making the claim. But you're saying
oh yeah.
something a
I
little different.
I feel like you think that I'm saying that the semantic ontology layer is model everything. I'm actually trying to say like I think there's specific ways that we can extend our current mental model of the semantic ontology layer to cover an entire company and then get to
Yeah, I think we're
pure.
saying the same thing. It's just that we're
Yeah, we are.
we're
We are.
use we're using the word semantic ontology because there's nothing else to describe it.
There's
But
nothing.
what I'm pointing towards to is that layer
Yeah.
is going to be a pretty important thing that's going to tendril out
Yeah.
into many, many things. And you can't, yeah. And
Oh, yeah.
if you adhere to the stack theory of enterprise tools or just tools in general on how humans
Uh-huh.
operate, then I'm just saying that in that stack space, okay, let's just say in that stack space of tools and semantics in an organization, one is that a new layer will form is one proposition hypothesis. If that layer forms, that probably one such variant of that layer will be the most popular one. It's kind of like democracy being the most, the best form of government for capitalism, let's say, in the form of the United States. And that will form, and whatever that is, we don't know. You don't know. I don't know specifically how that's going to be, but it's likely going to start with this semantic ontology esque shape. It's going to be probably
Yeah.
a derivative of that, at least logically. It might not actually, like specifically, it might not look like that, but at least like it will be inspired by that. Just like
Yeah.
how the Constitution was inspired by the Magna Carta or other constitutions beforehand. Of course, you're inspired by that, right? So it's probably going to be something like that.
Yeah. I feel like I feel a little I don't know why I'm in this. I feel like I'm pigeonholed somehow, but like not in a bad way. It just like I kind of feel like Richard Hendricks, like Silicon Valley, like when he tried to make a new internet. Like I guess I'm kind of pointing to like I feel like there is like an optimal set of primitives that can elegantly map. Anyways, leave that for another day.
But optimal set of primitives that could map what?
That can like elegantly map what the semantic ontology is trying to ultimately map. And I don't exactly know what that looks like, but it's like some sort of maybe it is like context retrieval combined with what we've landed on, right? Which is like deterministic workflows, agentic workflows that kind of blend probabilism with determinism, a proper like semantic layer and a grammar for defining SQL queries. But yeah, I wonder, and maybe like the proper semantic ontology will just grow out from that. And I imagine like that will work.
Or
I
are you
guess I'm
saying that it's not clear that starting with the context engineering is the right way to build a
yeah
semantic ontology? Like, I don't know if this is the right way. I'm just saying I'm hypothesizing that this is a way, but There's a human-based system. So if we learn anything in technology, is that if there is momentum building in such a in a single direction that there's like
Right.
consensus over, and it compounds rather quickly, even if it's not the most like technically savvy way, let's say, it still goes through. Like, is USB the best standard? I don't know. Like, at VHS versus like Betamax, like, no, like, you this is yes, I agree that
Mhm, mhm.
there if you searched over the whole space, maybe there is like a marginally better way of doing it, or even like a
Uh,
significantly better way of doing it. But like, technology is chosen by humans. So if there's human consolidation, and this is what we're saying, right? Like, by sharing this news is like, hey, there's like human consolidation, and you're saying, "Oh, but just if you just look at it purely from a software perspective, or whatever, a theoretical perspective or physical perspective, that this
uh,
might not be true." And what I'm saying is like, who the fuck cares? It's the case, because if all the humans choose this one, like, what does it matter what the theoretically better thing is?
let's move on.
What was the point that you want to make? Is that other people are wrong theoretically, but practically they might be right?
No, I'm I'm trying to devise a system for the semantic ontology from first principles. That's what I'm trying to do. But I think it's like um, it's not something we could solve in this call, but also like practically speaking, I think you and I have had this discussion before, but like even if we were to construct something like deeply elegant, the world already works in a certain way. And
Yeah.
sometimes the best step isn't to like hop skip to the optimal solution. Maybe the internet, like if you had like AI or the internet, maybe like you needed to go through the internet first, even if you could have just gone to AI.
No, no, I see what you mean, but like,
Path dependent integrals again. I'm just gonna keep throwing out like, yeah, let's go
no, no,
back
no,
to
but why don't you just invent, like, English is not the best language to even talk about this, so why don't you invent a better language
I
than
yeah,
English?
I
So,
see I see I see the like I
like, you
see
have to start. You have to accept some abstractions first to like start thinking about things. You can't
I
first
know.
principles all the way down. You got to
I know.
start
Like
somewhere.
my brain is just breaking right now because I'm just like, yeah, you need to make a new like there shouldn't be an L.
Yeah,
Um
you gotta make some incremental progress on top of what other like pretty smart people have already thought about. Robert, you can't always
just
first principles everything.
can I go down one more tangent on this? Because it's
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
so like Joseph and I have talked about how I mean both of us like try to be self-aware and try to like watch what our emotions are driving us to do, but also like what our thoughts are kind of spontaneously pushing us towards as well. One thing that we've discussed is like sometimes before you start thinking words, you think proto thoughts, which are just like these kind of like hints of a thought that almost take on this like cognitive posturing in your brain. It's almost like a diagram that has like connects like feeling like for me, it's like a diagram that kind of connects feeling tones. It's not a diagram, but it's just like like
It's a
that's
scaffold that you retrieve. Your LLM brain is retrieving that scaffold, and
exactly like
you don't
that's
quite know
emergence,
what that
right?
scaffold is.
Like I can say the word emergence because it just has such a like history in my in my brain and in my life that like before I say it, there's a physiological signature of what it does to me. And that is like a proto thought, right? But the thing that I immediately got to, Joe, was just like what? Like, so we've talked about how like sometimes it's lossy, but you can reason in proto thinking, right? Which makes you, which like I can get really fast. Like I can just like, I don't have to say emergence is the phenomenon that we're talking about. I can just like invoke the feeling of it and then we can move to the next thing, like holding that in place as I like reason about the next thing. And the next thing can also be a proto thought. And like sometimes, like this is why I think this is the basis of Joseph's intuition, which we haven't ever talked about, but I think it's quite good about like when connecting many pieces of information together. But why, like this is some sort of, it's like a lower dimensional, it's not I guess it's kind of like an embedding.
No, I feel like the proto thoughts are actually higher dimensional. It's just that the brain is not able to. It's kind of like a process by which the proto thoughts become more solidified through words and logic, and it finally comes out.
Yeah.
It's not to say that the words are more precise
Yep.
and it actually points as higher resolution, but I think profound thinking, I don't think that is done over the base
Or,
word space. Like, this is,
uh-huh. I
you
agree.
know, there's some calculations being done on the base word space, and there's like calculations being done on the proto thought space. And I feel like the proto thought space, if you do calculations there natively, like, you can move a lot faster, and then you distill it down to the word space, and then you communicate.
That's right. And it feels like it's almost like dynamic projections of like complex ideas into like different rotated space. Like word space is just like one projection of truth, right?
Oh, definitely,
But like
definitely.
it's
It's
just
one of the
like
best ones we have, though.
that's right. It's one of the best ones we have. Like I think the proto thinking space is one where you're able to like project in a different way, which isn't word space
Yeah, yeah,
without
yeah.
having to like verbalize
Right.
all of the repercussions, like everything, all of the like things that relate to emergence in these axes, right? These
Yeah.
other axes that aren't really not very easily, concisely able to be laid out in words.
Or you
Like you're
say that
holding the
it just takes you a long time to verbalize because you're doing a lot of calculations in the proto space?
just saying I'm doing something even worse, Joseph. I'm just saying that like LLM should be thinking in proto space, not in word space. And so like really the first principles approach to creating the semantic ontology should be like recreating the LLM. Because I think like protospace is more important for defining the higher order eigenvectors of an organization than word space. That's
Yeah.
my
Yeah, but there's also another thesis, which is, I mean, we talked about this, but this may not be true, but it seems like it might be true, which is, look, like we're all working under the notion that, we are talking about this one unified semantic space that everybody's talking about. Like we're using English to describe it, but there is some underlying structure to the semantic space that we're all pointing towards.
yeah.
And it's like a super high dimensional space. It just so happens to be, it could be projected down into the word space and you could just talk about things in the word space. But the LLMs just learned that through the internet, LLMs just learned that space, right? And so just because we're using English to prompt it and use it doesn't mean that the underlying architecture of it is not learned by learned
I
into
know.
the semantic space, which is the proto space. And so like it's like if
I
you
was
have
saying maybe
yeah,
it's just embeddings. Maybe they're just embeddings, right?
what are embeddings of words?
Like protospace, maybe it's just embeddings. Or it's some
But
sort of
it
like it's a truncated part of the neural net, right?
yeah,
It's or maybe one layer.
but it's like a data problem, right? Like if we don't have sufficient data to map it, then there is no way for us to map it anyway. So it's kind of like a limitation of of data and technology. Not so that's like all we have to work with, right?
Yeah. No, that's true, but it just like I don't know. I don't need to go down this rabbit hole, but like it just occurs to me that like like everyone talked about the singularity being like the LM being able to like improve itself, right? But like it's like it's such a roundabout way that it currently does it. Like you would have to change the code that is used to train it, right? Right. I'm really going off on this tangent for way too long. Let's go back to data. Let's go back to data. Joe.
What is your finishing thought?
My finishing thought is that I think everything that I've talked about so far is a great example of why first principles thinking cannot continue infinitely.
No, I
Um,
think that if you continue on the first principles thinking, then you'll eventually come to some roadblocks and then realize that actually the what's actually happening right now is kind of pretty reasonable. It's like one of the reasonable equilibria that could have happened. That is not a complete destructive equilibria. And I think you're just like going down the rabbit hole and questioning things. I mean,
I
this is why
feel
you wanted to be an academic in the first place. But then and sometimes you have to know that sometimes you should have like a function that tells you the likelihood of finding novel insights that are convexly beneficial to what we're doing now.
I understand. Look,
You have a
here,
uniform distribution. You have a uniform prior on the probability of traversing down the rabbit holes.
look, here's the human thing that's happening. I haven't talked to Joseph in this way in a little while, like in a minute. We haven't had the podcast in a while. I haven't had an outlet to think like this, and my brain is going into complete overdrive.
All right. Let's let's move on to the agentic workflows topic.
Wow, great.
I
Yeah.
think I think OpenAI launched workflows
Yeah.
pretty recently. Uh, and I think what we want to call that agentic workflows, which is a different
Yeah.
concept compared to just workflows, right? I think workflows have been around. Workflow automation has been around in the form of, let's say, robotic process automation, automation anywhere, UiPath, etc. And there's like newer automation companies like Zapier and Lindy, N8N, etc. Even data specific companies like Alteryx. These companies were on the forefront of automation to some degree, but I think these were non-agentic automations. So these were mostly rule-based automation companies. And
Yeah.
I think what's different from what is coming out of OpenAI, and I think what we think will be coming out of other companies, is the fact that agentic automation has agents natively built into the system. So you have a hybrid of determinism that is begotten from linking together if then statements and deterministic logic, and then you have agents dictating part of the nodes of the graph, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then also I think you could have agents that also know how to use that workflow too. And very naturally, I think there is also some blurring of the lines between agents and workflows. Like, I think you go into the agent builder in OpenAI, and then they also call that thing that you're building a workflow. So is
Yeah.
that an agent? Is that a workflow? We see this in companies like Lindy, where you know people are starting to use this thing kind of interchangeably, which is confusing to me. And I told you, no, hell no, these are not the same things conceptually. But maybe practically, this is what people who are thinking about things now. And this is okay. And
Yeah.
this is an instance of where even if conceptually and theoretically things are not the same, if practically everybody's moving towards that direction, then I will accept that, okay, this is like the accepted convention to some degree that is not stoppable. And I will
Yeah.
stop my first principles thinking at.
I agree with you.
Go ahead.
Okay, and this honestly, like, I'm gonna rein it back now. This feels like an extension of the whole prompt engineering, context engineering discussion, right? But like, I think this is exactly like the missing piece of what frustrated me so much about just like the concept of context architecture. Like, context engineering implies that like this is like what the agent needs to know how to think. Like, sorry. This is the context is like what the agent, like the content of what the agent can think about, right? Whereas like agentic workflows or whatever is like, it ensures that it understands how to think, right? And I think as much as like you can bundle everything into a single term like semantic ontology, it does feel like these are kind of separable objects, like context architecture and whatever else, like reasoning architecture.
Reasoning architecture. Yeah. Okay. Fair.
Um, and I guess like it might even be the case that like the world is kind of moving in this direction, segmenting these two, because clearly these are two different posts, right? Like there's one about
Yeah.
context, there's one about
But what if like the ELT thing happens, Robert? EL and T are separate, and then they become ELT, right? Like, so eventually
huh.
they will get merged in. So if you look, a little bit further ahead,
Should we have started two companies
yeah.
instead and like come back?
So it is likely. If everything kind of rhymes with the past, I think you're
Yeah,
right. I think context engineering and reasoning engineering, like these will be two separate disciplines with two different
yeah,
slices of the stack, and then maybe there'll be separate companies doing it, but eventually and
yeah,
probably pretty quickly that things will merge and you will verticalize that stack, so to speak. And right now, I guess the semantic ontology layer is only the context, right? There's no reasoning side because there was no need to have the reasoning side of things because without LLMs, you just didn't need that metadata, right? If you're considering that metadata.
yeah. That's right. And I mean, like it feels like this problem is a lot more entangled than like ETL, ELT, or sorry, ELT
Yeah,
transformations.
yeah.
And as a result, like it does I'm I'm trying hard not to justify it because this is what we are. Like, it does seem to make sense. Of course, like we work with people and we know that it makes sense that like these things should be integrated into a single, at least for data, like into a single unified structure.
You mean horizontally or vertically? Like context
Yeah,
and
yeah,
reasoning
yeah,
should
yeah.
be okay. Yeah.
Exactly. They should be part of the same thing.
Mhm.
I'm just trying to. There's a small part of my brain that's like, hey, DBT and Fivetran did this circuitous thing. Should we do the same thing? And like, it's clearly not the same, exactly the same. It's
Yeah, I
just
mean,
like
it's
the
just an
parallels are
analogy,
kind of
right?
funny.
Like it's like
It's just an
it's like
analogy,
some
yeah.
parallels, but yeah, this is where first principle, like you need both first principles thinking and like reasoning by analogy to
Yeah,
try to
bad
span the whole
precedent.
space. Yeah, and like, I think he's right. I mean, because like ELT is such a actually at the end of the day, it's a pretty simplistic thing that's happening conceptually, but
Mhm.
I think the context layer plus the reasoning layer, like this is like way more profound in the sense of it's sort of like a much larger cardinality space than the ELT space occupies
Yeah,
in the space of work done by
yeah,
software and agents.
yeah,
So if you're in a larger space, then but like if you're in a larger space, then the standard has to form, and the standards will be get formed by whatever standard is able to be adopted by the most amount of auxiliary services that plug into it, right? So that's
yeah,
why I think it's important to feel like the semantic ontology thing is not only data limited. It's not limited to just a data field because what's going to happen is if we think that
yeah, yeah.
then we're
I
going to
see.
build something and then the other fuckers are going to come in and destroy that standard because, they're going to build a Python and we're like, oh no, we have to use R because it's better. And it's like, fuck off. Like Python is much better because it's like a global standard for everything, not just data science, right? So like you don't want to be Pythonified. You want to, from the get go, think about Python, becoming the Python, right?
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Not pigeonholed into being R.
You
Rest
know,
in peace.
rest in peace. Crazy coming from you, who was R was your language, right?
No, Python was my first language, and then no, MATLAB was, and then Python, and then I was forced to use R, and then I'm like, okay, actually, I could do things like 5 times faster in R, and then back to Python.
I miss MATLAB sometimes. I'm all over the place today. I'm sorry, but I just I do miss MATLAB sometimes. It's just so simple. The world was so easy.
This episode will require a lot of edits, Robert.
That's fine. It'll be fun for people.
Okay. Well, let's wrap up. I think we talked about a few things: data consolidation happening, context engineering, and as opposed to, I guess, reasoning engineering, which is, I guess, okay, you coined this now in this podcast. Okay, reason
Right.
engineering. You heard it here first. Then, the importance of agentic workflows, how it's different from traditional workflows, and how this is in the thesis of injecting determinism. So, like, you're not solely relying on the agent to make choices, and actually, you're relying on the agent very little, like as little as possible is perhaps the best if you could choose. Actually, that's really related to, if you have a statistical view of the space of workspaces or workflows, and then you could actually come to the conclusion that with a small amount of determinism, you could actually try to span most of the space by introducing some amount of extrapolation using the LLMs rather than labeling the entire jungle with a label maker. I think this is something that was talked about on LinkedIn. I think I read this. Somebody from Ramp, I think, wrote this, but I think saying that the semantic ontology thing is labeling labels to everything in a jungle. Okay, fair. That's a pretty dramatic characterization, but I think if
Mhm.
you assume that things are power law distributed, in which a few finite amount of things truly matter, and you have a very long tail, then you would have to assume and conclude that probably the vast majority, like 90%, 95% of cases can be covered by a quite finite number of labels. And from that perspective, you should not be using a uniform distribution in your label space to consider things.
That's the theme of this podcast episode. Uniform.
Yes, please prioritize the right things. Let's think about the right underlying distribution to prioritize our own LLMs, our own brain LLMs to think. All right. All
It's
right.
breaking down.
There you have it, folks. Agentic Data episode 7. We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye,
All
everybody.
right. Bye.